Welcome to Sarpy Outlook. I'm Peg O'Dea Lippert. Our guest today is Dennis Crawford. Dennis is a private practice attorney in Lincoln. He is the second associate chair of the Nebraska Democratic Party and is a political blogger, the Prairie Populist. Welcome, Dennis.
Well, thanks, Peg. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with you, and I salute the good work of the Sarpy County Democrats. Your Outlook TV show has gone very well so far. You did a great job last year in electing Sue Crawford to the state legislature. She's made us all proud.
Well, thank you for that nice compliment. Dennis, as an issue-based program, our topic today is to evaluate our elected officials from Nebraska and Washington. And I'd like you to address that issue from your broad political knowledge, your astute legal mind, and as a keen and insightful blogger. So if we could start by talking in a general way first about our delegation.
Well, our delegation is really pretty disappointing. I would say the first thing is obstruction. On the night of the inauguration of January 20th, 2009, the House Republican leadership got together and they decided that a strategy of all-out obstruction was their path back to power. They're going to oppose everything that President Obama proposed. Similar conversations occurred on the Senate side. Early in the Obama administration in 2009, several Republican senators approached Vice President Biden and said, "We're under orders from Mitch McConnell. We're not to cooperate with you in any way possible. We're supposed to oppose everything in order to regain power." And the Nebraska members of Congress have followed that strategy of obstruction. They've voted no on virtually every policy initiative coming from President Obama since he took office in 2009. The second thing I would emphasize about them is they're all backbenchers. None of them are in any position of leadership. Lee Terry's been a member of the House for 15 years now. You would think that with that time he would have gained some seniority, would have obtained a leadership position, but Lee Terry is just a backbencher in the House. His number one legislative accomplishment is renaming a couple of post offices. Deb Fischer, so far in her short tenure in the Senate, has pretty much aligned herself with the Tea Party. She broke campaign promises to oppose the Ryan Plan. Adrian Smith is completely a non-factor in the House, and Jeff Fortenberry is also a non-factor in the House as well. I mean, in the House, for example, we recently had a failure to pass the Farm Bill, and Fortenberry, Smith, and Terry were nowhere to be found. They were not trying to exert any leadership to bring together some kind of bipartisan consensus on a farm bill that would help our state. And I'd say the third thing about them is that they pander relentlessly to the right wing of the Republican Party with certain rare exceptions. I mean, if you want, what they basically do is they vote no for anything that President Obama is for, and they pretty much just follow orders from the party leaders, and you can predict what they're going to do by just watching Fox News or Rush Limbaugh. They just go with the right-wing party line with some certain very rare exceptions.
Well, now, didn't Lee Terry actually have the chairmanship of some subcommittee this year, finally?
He does.
He does have some.
But he's not accomplished anything yet.
Well, let's start, or continue, I should say, Dennis, with looking at each. And let's start with our senior one-term senator, Mike Johanns, who I understand has decided now not to run again. How would you rate individually his performance on behalf of Nebraska?
He's been a non-factor as far as a performance for anybody, Republican, Democratic voters, independent voters. He's been a complete and total non-factor. Mike Johanns has a history of quitting every political job he's ever been in. He was on the county board in Lancaster County. He quit to run for the city council. He got elected to the city council. He quit that job to run for mayor of Lincoln. Was elected mayor of Lincoln. He quit that job to run for governor. Got elected governor. He quit being governor to become Secretary of Agriculture under the Bush administration. He quit his job as Secretary of Agriculture to run for the U.S. Senate. And after just one term, he's already quitting on us again. That's the hallmark of Mike Johanns' career. I recently read a really interesting book on the passage of the Dodd-Frank Act called Act of Congress by Robert Kaiser of the Washington Post. And they just, the book described the process behind the passage of the Dodd-Frank Act. Johans was on the banking committee, which had jurisdiction over the bill, and Johans had no interest in the bill. He contributed nothing to the bill in the Senate Banking Committee in 2009 and 2010. In contrast, 2 or 3 Republicans actually played a pretty active role in helping pass the Dodd-Frank bill out of the Senate Banking Committee in 2009 or 2010, but Johans had nothing to do with it. He had no interest in the topic at all.
Why is he there?
That's a good question. Why has he ever been in public office? I can't think of any accomplishment that Mike Johans has ever made in any of the various offices that he's held. I think he's done a lot for himself, but I don't think he's done much for the voters.
What about our junior senator, Deb Fischer?
Well, Deb Fischer so far has been a deep disappointment. When she was running for the Senate last year, it was pretty obvious to me that her resume was pretty thin and she was not qualified for the job. And she's already broken promises. Last year, during one of the debates with Bob Kerrey, she promised to vote against the Ryan plan, which privatizes Medicare, creates a voucher program out of it, brings back pre-existing condition clauses, requires senior citizens to buy health insurance with the return of pre-existing condition clauses. She voted for that plan earlier this year in the Senate after she promised to vote against it. Another broken promise was she promised an up or down vote for Chuck Hagel as Secretary of Defense.
That was shameful.
And she voted to filibuster his nomination. Fortunately, there were enough votes to break the filibuster, and Senator Hagel was confirmed. But she's broken 2 major promises in connection with her short time as a senator. Recently, she made some false statements about the immigration reform bill on the floor of the Senate. She claimed there was no border security provisions in the bill. Well, the bill doubles the amount of border security guards. It builds an additional 350-mile fence. She obviously has not read the bill, and Senator John McCain blasted her for her ignorance and lack of knowledge about the bill.
Yeah, that was really obvious that she hadn't read the bill, because she also proclaimed that there was no provision to send felons out of the country, and yet in the analysis in the Omaha World Herald, it was.
Yeah, it's pretty obvious she didn't really know it was in the bill, and I don't know if she has any real interest in it either.
What about, we could start perhaps with Congressional District 1. That would be your representative, Jeff Fortenberry. Give us what your view from your background is on Mr. Fortenberry.
Well, Jeff Fortenberry it pretty much follows the Republican Party line, but he is the only member of the delegation that's actually breached the Republican Party line. I mean, Fortenberry voted for the Ryan plan, which privatizes Medicare. Fortenberry is opposed to a path to citizenship for aspiring citizens. He's opposed to immigration reform. But in one area where he's kind of surprised me, and probably surprised us all, was he's rejected the Grover Norquist No New Taxes pledge. Grover Norquist is a Fortune 500 lobbyist, a longtime Republican activist, and he requires Republican members of Congress to sign a pledge saying you will never support a tax increase. Well, Jeff Fortenberry, rejected that pledge, and he actually has voted for some tax increases. He voted against the payroll tax cut for the middle class, Social Security pay. He voted against the Social Security payroll tax cut in 2011, so he voted for a middle class tax increase. Fortenberry surprised us all by voting against the extension of the Bush tax cuts in 2010, and then Fortenberry surprised us when he voted for the fiscal cliff bill earlier this year. And that vote had very interesting consequences for Nebraska politics. When Fortenberry voted for the fiscal cliff bill, which raised taxes on the wealthy, a right-wing super PAC financed by some billionaires said that if Fortenberry ran for statewide office, they would run millions of dollars in ads and go after him. And I suspect that was a factor in his deciding not to run for governor or U.S. senator.
Oh, really? Well, he does seem to be the more thoughtful of our delegates.
Well, with this delegation, unfortunately, that's not saying a lot, because he's generally, with those rare exceptions, he's voted the Republican Party line pretty much all the way.
Well, let's talk about Lee Terry from CD2. You've mentioned him earlier, but tell us, give us an evaluation of his performance. After how many years? 14? He's in his 14th year, I believe his 7th term.
He was first elected in 1998, and like I said, he's had a very undistinguished time as a member of Congress. The only legislation to his credit is renaming a post office.
Is that really true?
That is true. And what's also interesting about Terry was when he ran for re-election in 2012, he claimed that he was this great fiscal hawk. He was for fiscal responsibility. We had to stop the spending. But when George Bush was president, Lee Terry voted for 2 tax cuts, 2 wars, the Medicare Part D program, and the bank bailout bill. And all those expensive pieces of legislation were put on the national credit card. So basically, Lee Terry's votes turned a $1 turned a $238 billion surplus in 2000 left behind by President Clinton into the $1.3 trillion deficit that President Obama inherited from George Bush. So Lee Terry is part of that irresponsible Republican Congress that doubled the national debt during the Bush administration.
Well, perhaps this would lead to a whole other discussion, but it does seem that he's trying to make a name, if you will, for himself on the Keystone Pipeline.
He is for the Keystone Pipeline. He's finally showing a little bit of activity. That's one of the few things he's ever really done as a congressman. But another thing that we should realize about Lee Terry is he's broken a number of promises on Social Security. Every odd-numbered year between September and November, Lee Terry is the great champion of Social Security and Medicaid. But in the odd-numbered years, when he's back in Washington, you get the radical Lee Terry that votes with the radical right wing. He's voted for the Medicaid privatization plan that would cost seniors an additional $6,000 in out-of-pocket medical expenses every year. He's voted to raise the retirement age to 70 for Social Security. So he breaks his campaign promises on a regular basis to protect senior citizens. Lee Terry has voted to repeal Obamacare 37 times.
That's incredible, incredible.
I mean,
Dennis.
The repeal of Obamacare would strip tens of millions of people of health insurance. 6 million young people have health insurance thanks to Obamacare. Over 10 million children have health insurance thanks to Obamacare. And Lee Terry would take it away from these people.
Incredible. Tell us about Adrian Smith. We don't hear too much about him from the 3rd Congressional District of Nebraska.
There's a reason for that. He has no congressional record, no accomplishments whatsoever. He's voted a straight party line without exception. He supported, like I said, he supported the Ryan Plan, which would privatize Medicaid. But one little known feature of the Ryan Plan, it reduces the corporate top rate from 39% to 25%. It reduces the individual top rate from 39% to 25%. So when Smith and the other Nebraska Republicans voted for the Ryan Plan, I mean, they voted for tax cuts for hedge fund managers, billionaires, oil companies, insurance companies, banks. I mean, people don't need tax cuts. At the same time, they finance those tax cuts with cuts to Medicare and Medicaid. I mean, 63% of the cuts in the Ryan Plan come from programs that benefit the poor, and Adrian Smith has been a part of that group that has voted for these regressive policies. And another thing that should be noted about Adrian Smith was the fiscal cliff bill that passed early this year. He voted against it. That included an extension of the farm bill, so Adrian Smith voted against an extension of the farm bill earlier this year.
So it would appear, on one level at least, that these elected officials are voting against our best interest. How do they represent the interest of Nebraska?
They don't represent the interest of Nebraska. They represent the wealthy special interests that finance their campaigns. I mean, the Club for Growth is a front group financed by Wall Street and billionaires, and the Club for Growth spent tens of millions of dollars to elect Jeff Fortenberry and Adrian Smith to the Congress, and the Club for Growth favors the end of all agricultural subsidies. So they're really acting for the interests of the big corporations and Wall Street and insurance companies, and not for the average voter in Nebraska. Unfortunately, most Nebraska voters are not aware of their records, and it's our duty to bring that record to the attention of the voters. If the voters knew what these guys really stood for, I think they'd have some real problems getting reelected.
Well, and that is part of the purpose for this issue-based program, Dennis, and appreciate your insight. As you look ahead to 2014, what do you envision, and particularly for the Senate, since Johans is not going to run again?
Well, just generally on the national level, I feel very optimistic on the national level. Democracy Corps ran a recent poll that shows that at the current time, the Democrats are leading the Republicans in the race for control of the House of Representatives.
Really?
Democracy Corps is run by Paul Begala, who used to work for President Clinton. Democracy Corps was the only polling group that correctly forecast President Obama's 4-point victory last fall. Most other polling companies saw a narrow Obama victory, but Democracy Corps correctly predicted a 4-point victory for President Obama, and they're currently forecasting, knock on wood, that the Democrats lead in the race for the House of Representatives right now, so I feel optimistic on a national level. I think in CD2, I think Lee Terry is very vulnerable. 3 of the last 4 elections in CD2 have been very close. John Ewing only lost 51 to 49%.
Less than 2%, I believe. Yeah.
Correct. And I'm confident we'll find a strong candidate to take on Lee Terry next year because he is vulnerable for the reasons that we spelled out.
What about the other 2 congressmen, and more specifically, Senator Johannes.
Okay.
Well, not his seat, but that slot.
Well, it's an open seat right now. We have no declared candidates, so it's really too early to tell what's going to happen with the U.S. Senate. But at the current time, though, it represents an opportunity for us because the Republicans are running their B team for the U.S. Senate, okay? Johannes isn't running for re-election. Heinemann chose to go into the private sector. Fortenberry chose not to run for the U.S. Senate. So they're running their B team. They're running Ben Sass, some guy that worked for Bush that no one's ever heard of.
Exactly.
Shane Osborne, who
Can fly a plane. Or land a plane.
he can land a plane. When he was the state treasurer, though, he held a job working for an insurance firm at the same time, so he spent a lot of his time just working for himself rather than the public when he was a state treasurer. And then we have an Omaha trialer, Bart McClay, has announced to run for the U.S. Senate. You know, normally the Republicans bash trial lawyers like Steve Lathrop or Bruce Braley in Iowa. Well, I'm going to say is when the Republicans start bashing Steve Lathrop as a trial lawyer, I'll just simply erase Steve Lathrop's name from the Nebraska Republican Party press releases, plug in Bart McClay's name in those press releases, and give them back to the press.
And what about Adrian Smith? Is there anything surfacing out of the 3rd District?
Well, Mark Sullivan has been running for Congress out there. He ran the last time for several months, and Mark is running equally hard this time. And I think
harder, I think, because he got an earlier start.
Right. So I think Mark's going to work it hard and do the best he can to educate the voters about Smith's terrible voting record.
Okay, good. Well, so it's going to be interesting upcoming year, isn't it?
It is, and I feel pretty optimistic about our chances on all levels.
Oh, really? And the state positions as well as our federally elected positions.
Yeah, we did very well in the 2012 cycle in the legislative races. We fielded
we
fielded some strong candidates, and I think that will create some momentum. I mean, in my town of Lincoln, we have all kinds of good Democratic candidates who are already running for the legislature. They're raising money. They're going door to door. So there's a lot of optimism. There's a lot of enthusiasm out there.
Well, and we did outstanding as far as the leadership in the Nebraska unicameral this past term. It was really, really great to see, and we have wonderful young, enthusiastic people representing us there.
We do.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Dennis, for being with us and sharing your views regarding how our Nebraska delegation represents us, how they would appear to fail to seek the common good for all Nebraskans. And thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, and thank you for your good work here in Sarpy County.
Thanks, Dennis.